Dear brothers and sisters, peace be with you. Thank God it's time to read Bible. We will continue to read Genesis chapter 3 this week. Genesis is a book about beginning. Satan came into play from chapter 3. This is a very serious event. As of today, each saint saved by grace is still disturbed by Satan. Is Satan really that powerful? Before we start chapter 3, let's have an overview of the Bible. It will help us to see the role that Satan plays in God's universal plan. The whole Bible structure is symmetrical. We have read chapter 1 and chapter 2. The two chapters are very important. Genesis chapter 1 reveals God's purpose in His creation. Genesis chapter 2 reveals process and ways to achieve God's purpose. For example, man was formed. He had spirit, soul, and body. He was put in the garden of life. There was river of life watering the whole garden. He also made a woman for the man. He set the rule of marriage. Man should leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they become one flesh. There was no Satan, sin, or death in these two chapters. Then till the end of the Bible, the last two chapters, Revelation chapter 21 and 22, we see that God's purpose is achieved. Revelation chapter 21 verse 2, the holy city, the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Then we see the structure of New Jerusalem, the gold raising and onyx spreading around on the surface of Havilah at the beginning became a well-built city. The whole city was made of pure gold. The wall was decorated with every kind of precious stone. The gates were made of pearl. There was no Satan, sin, or death, either in the last two chapters of Revelation. The purpose of God's creation was achieved at the end. This should be the assurance of each Christian. Our hope does not put us to shame. On this foundation, let's take a look at what happened between Genesis chapter 3 and Revelation chapter 21. Chapter 3, Satan came in to play through the snake. He became the king of the world. Romans chapter 5 verse 12 tells us, just as sin entered the world through one man, and the death through sin, and in this way death came to all people. Then verse 14, death reigned. So Satan seemed to be very furious after he entered in Genesis chapter 3. He reigned through death. The sting of death is sin. The power of sin is law. This is recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 56. Satan will use sin and death to reign this world until Christ's return. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul talked about the return of Christ. The perishable will be clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. Paul boasted about it in chapter 15, verse 55. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Satan started to play his role from Genesis chapter 3. It lasts till the three but last chapter of Bible, which is Revelation chapter 20. It says in chapter 20 verse 2, he sees the dragon, that ancient serpent. In Genesis chapter 3, it was a small snake that came out to tempt man. In Revelation chapter 20, it became an ancient serpent, who is the devil or Satan. He will be bound for 1,000 years in Revelation chapter 20. In chapter 20, verse 7, when the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison. After he is released, he will be devoured by fire. Verse 10, he was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. As we read Genesis chapter 3, we should know the end of Satan. Although he might be furious in this age, and oftentimes he persecuted God's people, but his ending is certain. So we should read Genesis chapter 3 with hope and assurance. We know God will eventually defeat Satan. Let's recall how man failed the first time and try to find the reason. It will help us to know how to resist Satan's attack in our Christian life. Chapter 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. The snake mentioned here was Satan. We should know that God's enemy Satan is also a created being. As a created being, his power was much less than God's. So the way that he used was tempting, testing, deceiving, and lying. All these are Satan's name in Bible. He is very crafty. The second half of verse 1. Snake said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden?" The first cause of man's fall was Satan's temptation. He always looked for the weak one to attack. In church, he will not look for saints that are strong. He will attack those who are weak and are not as strong in their faith. His first tactic is to make you doubt about God's words. Did God really say? Bible is God's words. The words of God is set in heaven, but Satan would use different examples, different crafty ways to make you doubt about God's words. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? Of course, this was not what God said. All the fruits from the trees in the garden were food for them. They must not eat from one of them, which was called tree of knowledge of good and evil. It is very important to read Bibles precisely. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for you to resist Satan's tactics. He used a proposition which obviously was wrong to tell the woman. Of course, he knew that woman would not agree with what he said, but his purpose was to start a conversation with the woman. He wanted to have a conversation with the woman, then he could attack her weak faith and her incomplete understanding of God's words in the conversation. The woman was fooled. Verse 2, the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden." This brought up the second reason of man's fall. Woman came forward. She didn't stay in her position. God formed Adam first. Then he took one of Adam's ribs to make a woman. The purpose of woman is to help man. But woman didn't stay in her position. She came forward. She shouldn't answer Satan's question. She should reign to Adam and leave it to Adam to deal with Satan. As she started the conversation with Satan, she gave Satan the opportunity to attack her. Verse 3, but God did say, "You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." The second sentence that Eve answered Satan was not accurate. The tree that is in the middle of the garden, she should just say, "Tree of the knowledge of good and evil." It may remind herself if she said the name of the tree. She only said the tree. It tells that she wasn't cautious enough over the tree. Then she said, "God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree and you must not touch it." God only said you must not eat. He didn't say you must not touch. Then she continued to say, "or you will die." God didn't say it in such a nice way. God said, "You will certainly die." In the original Hebrew, there are two deaths, death and death. Because she didn't know God's word, she gave Satan an opportunity to attack her. Verse 4, "You will not certainly die." The serpent said to the woman. When snake said this, maybe he even held the woman's hand to touch the fruit from the tree and said, "You didn't die." He was successful in making the woman to doubt about God's words. Then verse 5, "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will like God, knowing good and evil." The first tactic of Satan's attack is to make you doubt about God's words, then make you doubt about God's will, because he was afraid that you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Satan is the tempter and liar. What he said to the woman in the Garden of Eden, he has been repeatedly testing and tempting God's children. Satan's temptation was the first reason of man's fall. The second reason was that mankind didn't hold their position. In chapter 3, woman came forward to start a conversation with Satan. This was the second main reason of man's fall. You can also view this as a foreshadow. Isaiah chapter 54 verse 5 says, "For your maker is your husband, the Lord Almighty is his name." God created mankind. One day, this group of men will become God's bride. Woman didn't hold her position. She came forward. It foreshadowed that men didn't hold their position as bride for God and came forward on their own. When God put the man in the Garden of Eden, there was a tree of life in the middle of the garden. God's good will was for man to eat from the tree of life. The principle of the tree of life is dependence, for man to depend on God. When Satan came to tempt man, men shouldn't come forward on their own. Men shouldn't think that they could have victory over Satan. Men should run to God's protection. Men must be binded to God. When we face Satan's temptation, it's very important for us to stand at the right position. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8 to 11, "For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head." What Paul talked about here is covering the head. Because woman didn't cover the head at the time and came forward, it caused men's fall. So what we should hold on to today, just as it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3, "The head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." Woman didn't hold her position. She came forward to have conversation with Satan. She fell into Satan's trap and had doubt about God's words and God's will. Verse 6, "When woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eyes, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it." Up to this moment, Adam didn't show up at all. Woman was tempted by Satan. Then it is the role that her soul plays. Our soul cannot resist Satan. The function of soul includes mind, emotion, and will. Now her emotion came in. She said that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable. When emotion came in, she forgot God's words. In Satan's temptation, her mind started to work. "I will gain wisdom if I eat this, and I will be like God." The reason that Satan fell was that he wanted to be equal with God. The tactic that Satan used to tempt woman was that she could have wisdom, just like God. Then she made up her mind. Her will came in. She took the fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. We don't know where Adam was in the whole event, and when woman gave the fruit to Adam, it seems like he also forgot God's command. Adam also ate it. It brought forth man's first fall, because God said it clearly that when you eat from it, you will certainly die. Man couldn't even obey the most basic and easiest command. Sometimes we may think, is it really so serious? They just ate fruit from a tree. What we should pay attention to is that it's the whole principle. There were two trees in Garden of Eden. One of them was the tree of life. It tells that the principle of life is dependence on God. The other one is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Not just the knowledge of evil, even the knowledge of good will also lead us away from God and be independent from God. Because Adam's failure this one time, man's spirit died and soul corrupted. Then the body died. Maybe we can give an example. There's a toilet bowl cleanser at home. It's poisonous. Mommy kept warning her child, "You must not drink this." But when mommy was away, the child couldn't resist temptation. He drank it. After he drank it, the element of the poison entered into his body. When God created man, there wasn't sin in man. Because there is no sin, there's no death. Under Satan's temptation, man drank sin, the bottle of the poison. Sin brought death. The man that God created was polluted by Adam. So every man through Adam were born with sin nature. The concept of life inheritance has existed 3,005 years ago, when Moses wrote Torah. It seems like the purpose of God's creation was destructive. However, we should know that God's plan of salvation was predestined before he created the world. Satan destroyed, but God was saved by grace. Eventually, God will use men who failed and stumbled to judge Satan. From Genesis chapter 3, in which Satan entered into the scene, we should know that Satan always walked before God. God wanted man to eat from the tree of the life. Before man ate it, snake tempted man to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You will find that Satan always walked before God. In spiritual matters, counterfeit always came before the authentic. The principle that Satan had been using was the principle of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He let you get it and satisfy your desire first. But God's principle is the principle of life, saved by grace, so you can depend on God. Let's pray. Lord, as we look at how man felt in the past, these situations still happen every day around us. Help me to become someone depending on you. Help me so I won't come forward. I can stand in the position of obedience, following leading of the Holy Spirit. Bless my life so I can pray in front of you in all things, and I can follow the leading of Holy Spirit in all things, and I can live a victorious life. Pray in Jesus' name.